So this is a surprise panel, which I guess is in the fitness of things, because on tariffs, we are being whiplashed by one surprise a day, if not more often. So keeping that in mind, Evan, let me start with you. The US first said that they'll impose high tariffs on Mexico and Canada, then walked back a bit on that. Then they raised tariffs on everybody, and US constructs narratives, so they called it reciprocal tariffs, but no math showed that it was really reciprocal. It was high tariffs. And now suddenly it's been paused on everybody except China. Many US partners said that really it is Chinese overcapacity subsidizing which has brought the world to this stage. And the target should really be China rather than anybody else. So is it finally evolving into a US-China trade war? Is that where we are? Or is something else playing out?
Yeah. Well, first, thanks to GTS. Always good to be back. Is it a US-China trade war? Not really, because the real war now is between President Trump's policies and the markets. That's the real war, because what we've seen over the last several days is this broad liquidation by a lot of market participants of US assets. Anything branded USA, equities, bond yields blowing out, the dollar, and even things that are not risk assets are trading as if they're risk assets. So that's a very different situation, I think, than just saying this is some kind of tariff war between the US and China. And what's more, between the US and China, the tariffs aren't that relevant anymore, because when you're at 145% on one side, 125% on the other side, basically what you have is a two-way trade embargo. And that's essentially what we have now. The administration has articulated not one, not two, not three, but now four, at least, rationales for what they're doing. The first three of which are contradictory, and the fourth of which is new, the China one, is basically gaslighting. And we shouldn't let the Treasury Secretary gaslight us on this. The first rationale was this all about raising revenue, in which case you need high tariffs, but not so high that trade ceases, because then you can't collect any revenue. The second rationale is it's all reshoring. Well, but then you need trade prohibitive tariffs, contradictory to the first objective. The third thing we heard was this is actually about cutting deals. And if it's about cutting deals, then you need to be prepared to actually roll the tariffs back to take the tariffs off, which, by the way, they have not done, because they've left the universal 10%. And on top of that, you still have the sectoral tariffs in place. And Mr. Bessent says we may get tariffs on lumber and copper and so on. And so now we have this new rationale. It's all about China. And I'm sorry, it's gaslighting. Because if it had been about China, they would have gone about this differently from the get-go. They would never have tariffed allies in the way they had. And by the way, ask Canada and Denmark, among others, how they feel about the administration's posture toward alliances. So I think what we're in is actually a struggle between the president's policies and the markets. And in that, having worked for a former Treasury Secretary who dealt with a financial crisis in 2008, I would just say I would not bet on Mr. Trump.
Thanks, Evan. So Rosa, listening to Evan, it seems we don't know what the US objective is as they playing out these tariffs. Now, from the European perspective, how do you see the Europeans reacting to what's happening? Tariffs imposed on them, reduced a bit, but still high on steel, aluminum, automobiles. So how do you see the European reaction playing out?
Well, actually, with a certain amount of composure, I would say, I think Europeans have stopped divining what the strategy actually is. And had Trump placed this in the context of a US-China rivalry, it would have imposed stark choices on Europeans. But because it's been conducted in a way where the rationality is not clear, Europeans have really had to focus on finding an agreement. And in the end, there was an agreement. They did not. So the EU has quite a toolbox. Huh? I mean, the transatlantic economy is worth $9.5 trillion. 16 million jobs. So it's a two-way thing. The EU does have the tools to respond to a trade war. They have been preparing the toolbox for several months, but there were dissonant voices about how hard to hit back, and therefore the net result was composure in the face of the tariffs, which gave the EU the time for Trump to step back without facing his ire as the Chinese did. There was an interview in the Financial Times of the President of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. She said, we can do this, we can do that, we have several tools. In the meantime, we're going to start reaching out to other partners, and that's what we've seen in India here. If there's going to be a trade war between the US and China, well, Europe can start reaching out to other countries. It has 72 free trade agreements around the world. It is now accelerating talks with India. It's also starting talks with a number of other countries in Asia, Malaysia, Philippines, UAE. Just yesterday there was a phone call. So there's a lot of activity to try and hold back and find other sources of trade agreements.
Okay, thanks. Bjorn, I'll come to you. So you watch China very closely, and whatever be the US rationale or lack of it, at the moment the focus of action seems to be more on China. How do you see the Chinese reacting to it and the strategies they are putting in place?
Thanks, Arun. I think first point to notice and to highlight is that perhaps in contrast to many other parts of the world, China was not blindsided by this. China has been preparing for this fight for years, right? They knew this would be coming at some point. They've been meticulously building the toolbox, sharpened the instruments, written the playbook step by step, and they're now following it. They're also following the playbook step by step in almost, especially in contrast to all the excitement that Trump gives us, in almost boring predictability. Actually makes us as China watchers look really, really good at the moment, because it's so easy to anticipate what China's going to do next. It's all written down. It's all in the book. And what are they playing? What cards are they playing? I think China at the moment has like 2 active cards plus a wild card, and I'm actually not even counting import tariffs on US goods, because I don't think they scare pretty much anyone really, really significantly, perhaps except a couple of soybean farmers in the Midwest. But that's not a real card that China has. Always knew that they don't have it. So they have 2 other cards that they sharpen. First card is make life really, really difficult for US companies in the Chinese market, right? And that is a significant card. It does hurt. And they do so by kind of putting them on one of their 3 sanctions lists, but perhaps even more importantly, by kind of needling them with antitrust investigations, with cybersecurity reviews, these kind of things. So lots of tools around to do that. So first on my list would be watch Apple, see what happens there, Starbucks perhaps, and politically ultimately very interestingly, Tesla, right? So all of those could be on the mix. Second card, in the long term, much more significant from my point of view, export controls on raw materials, on critical minerals. And I don't think it has really sunken in how big that card actually is, especially on heavy rare earth minerals or heavy rare earth elements that are basically used and needed for everything that China has a very strong hold on, and kind of needed for, I don't know, everything from permanent magnets to sputter targets for semiconductor production, to lasers, to optics, to, I don't know, MRI applications, these kind of things. So everything. Yes, of course, the US has, with Mountain Pass, they have kind of minerals also to be mined, but those are light rare earths, right? And it's not heavy, and heavy is still in China. So perhaps I just mentioned the wild card that is left as the final point, and that is China's hold over US Treasury bonds. And 760 billion, not as much as a couple of years ago, but still significant, and we know how powerful that can be. So all these cards on the table. The wild card, I think China is kind of conveniently placed at the edge of the table just for everyone to see that it's there, but not quite ready to play it yet.
And the bond market has been reacting in a certain way.
Yeah, we've seen how sensitive this really is and how powerful that card is. Yeah.
And other than that, make life difficult for US business in China and cram down on some strategic resources and minerals. So that's so Ashley, coming to you, based in Washington, how are you assessing how India has responded to the Trump tariffs, especially as they've applied, while President Trump himself and others have positively spoken about the India relationship or the relationship with the Prime Minister, but always very, very critical of the tariffs. India is the tariff king and other things. So how have you assessed the Indian reaction?
So thanks, Arun, and of course, it's great to be back. I'll make 2 points. The first is we have to resist the temptation of thinking that there is a grand strategy with respect to the way we are using tariffs as a punitive instrument. The president has very strong impulses. He's had very strong views about the global trading system for many decades, and now he is finally in a position to act on those views that he's had for a long time. So in some sense, the actions of the last several weeks are consistent with complaints that he had, which predate the specifics that people have, some legitimate concerns about. So resist the temptation to think of this as a master plan that is unfolding in a sort of systematic way. Having said that, and this is the second point, the targets with respect to India are very specific. And again, they go back to the experience of the first term. With India, the target is increasing market access. And that's really all it is. Now, they tried in the first term to negotiate a package that would address some non-tariff barriers, but mostly tariff barriers. That did not come to conclusion. And so where he's picked up is literally where he left off. And so India, I think, has assessed his objective correctly and is now attempting to address those concerns that he has about market access by, in essence, putting a package that says, on a series of line items, India is willing to drastically reduce tariffs in the hope that there will be some reciprocal benefits that come to India. Ideally, those reciprocal benefits come quickly, immediately, in the context of this 90-day period. In the worst case, they hang out there, waiting to be implemented. And to my mind, it is that asymmetry in time that is going to cause the biggest political problems for the government of India. But at least with respect to India, there is a sort of a logic because it is precise and we know what the objectives are. On the broader objectives of the tariff strategy, I completely agree with what Evan said. I mean, there are too many cross-cutting and contradictory impulses to call it a genuine strategy.
Shruti, you're an academic. From your vantage and somewhat detached points, do you feel that the real world actors have gone mad?
Thank you, Arun. I don't think anyone is detached from the global trade system. So, to that extent, not so much. So the way we normally talk about trade in this room is trade politics. So all of you have been talking about reactions, and you really mean the reaction of a government leader or a minister and so on, right? I'm an economist, and when we think about international trade, we talk about reactions of people who actually put things in a bag, put it on a ship, and send it to each other. And anyone in this room who's filled out a GST form or a customs folio might be familiar with what we call the HSN classification. This is the harmonized system of nomenclature that we follow the world over. So for the uninitiated who've been fortunate never to fill this out, the first 2 digits will be, it's a long number. So the first 2 digits will be something like cereal and grain, for rice, right? The next 2 digits will specify that it's rice. The next 2 digits will be wholly milled rice or semi-milled rice. The next 2 digits will say polished or unpolished, and then so on and so forth. And you have, if we start calculating, I had to make a note of this, we have 99 chapters, we have 1,228 4-digit classifications, 5,387 6-digit classifications, and over 17,000 10-digit classifications. So when we say reaction, we mean reaction across these 17,000 different line items that now people need to figure out a new supply chain. And these things just don't happen by magic, right? Because supply chains, I mean, I grew up in Delhi about half a mile from here. You all know how far Chandni Chowk is. My mother is still buying her spices from the same place in Kharibali that her mother bought spices from. And if I request something specific to take back to the US, I'm pretty sure the same shop will send it to me. So our family has not changed its supply chain. So these things take a long time. So this idea that we can just upend the system and suddenly iPhones will be made somewhere else is entirely unrealistic. You know, you requested me to do this about 20 minutes before the session. I started counting the number of items for iPhones. I stopped at 50 because I don't have time. But in the HSN classification, just the parts of iPhones is more than 50. So this is going to take a while for people to readjust.
So what you're saying is that it'll be difficult to adjust. There'll be breakdowns in supplies. Prices will go up. Some products may not be available, and that's how this is going to play out. So coming to the next point, in the meantime, even as all this is playing out, people will also be working out alternative strategies, either looking at different markets, regional strategies, or technology development strategies, so that you look at a different pattern of production distribution, production sharing, some sectoral agreements. So, Evan, how do you see US working out a strategy in the coming period?
Oh, I think the US will largely be out of that. And I think the reality is this, I mean, where we're heading, the danger of where we're heading is that US industry ends up behind a high tariff wall, while the rest of the world is not necessarily behind that American tariff wall. The US is not going to export expensive US made products to the rest of the world. And so what's going to happen is there may continue to be a lot of the activity that you're describing among Europe, among Asia, and if I may say so, among India, but with the United States largely on the outside. And it gets to two questions. One is about the United States, and the other is about India. On the United States, I mean, if you take, I rarely disagree with my colleague Ashley Thomas, but if you take the kind of story that you told, which is that we're going to head for a period of deal making between the United States and others, that may be the case, but we need to ask, first, why is that deal making happening? And second, what kind of deals are we going to get? And third, therefore, is that the end of the story? And the reason it's happening is not because of a push for lowering, as you put it, market access barriers. It's because, frankly, Mr. Trump's policies are wrecking people's economies. And they're wrecking the global economy. Why are these, I think he said, was it 70 countries or 75 countries? They're calling me up. He said, quote unquote, they're kissing my ass. They're coming to make deals. Why are they coming to make deals? They're coming to make deals because he's wrecking their economies. And so when you're bleeding, you stanch the bleeding. Okay? But what kind of deals? You can't negotiate 75 deals in the time that we have. I mean, I worked for Bob Zoellick at one point. Bob Zoellick did the US-Australia Free Trade Agreement. That thing took years between Zoellick and Mark Vail. Okay? So the kind of deals we're going to get are not across and behind the border deals. These are going to be purchase deals. They're going to be at the border purchase agreements. And at the border purchase agreements, you can do that, but that's got nothing to do with changing the structural impediments, either in the United States or that face American business elsewhere. So the way we talk about market access is important because market access can mean market access for American companies to sell stuff, or it can mean the market access that I think India wants, which is American companies to invest here, make in India, make jobs. So if I were sitting in India, I would be surveying a landscape that's a little bit different. For example, I might ask a question about the RCEP agreement and the problem with being on the outside of RCEP, where between Vietnam and China, for example, now there's basically a 0% tariff wall on a lot of things. I understand why it happened. I understand the political debate here. I understand that India was very focused on protecting what it had, but the problem with protecting what you had is you're not as oriented on what you could have in the future. And in the landscape that's shaping up, that may lead India to a different set of conclusions about how it wants to reach deals, not with the United States, which is going to be this limited set of at-the-border purchase stuff, but to potentially, I would think it might be in your interest to be more open to much more ambitious deals of the kind that everybody but the United States is still interested in doing.
So
And that's where the Europe piece becomes interesting.
Rosa, what are the alternative strategies that Europe is looking at?
I mean, Europe has always put, in terms of reaching a deal with the United States, buy more LNG, buy more military kits. There's a spending surge in defense. But actually, the longer-term strategy is build, foreign free trade agreements with third countries, build relationships with third countries, and go global. And we've seen this. This is after 15 years in which the European Union has actually been quite introverted. All of a sudden, they're going global. Europe has done very well out of the free trading system. Europe's economy is deeply embedded into international trade and interdependence. And we saw in the Brexit years that actually Europe is willing to pull out its claws to protect its single market. So it's going to do that, and it's going to think long term in those issues, and short term in terms of finding something that will suit Trump's appetite. But that is where it's going. It's going to look for partnerships to think about modernizing WTO or finding new ways to reach agreements, to work on shared principles, and that's what it's going to try and do.
Beyond, for China, other than causing pain on US and US companies, what is the alternative strategy that you see emerging from there?
No, I think that trade flow diversion away from the US is, I think, one of the most fundamental, most structural things that come out of this trade flows from China to other markets in the rest of the world. And I think it's going to be very significant. You mentioned RCEP. I think that's one of the arenas where this is going to play out quite heavily. But at the same time, especially for technologically more advanced products that China is now also competitive in, they want to export, it's also not going to be a totally easy game. Many markets, India, Europe included, are worried about this and are not going to be kind of standing there open arms and welcoming Chinese products in. And China, from a Chinese perspective, China knows this really well. And I'm kind of also China always surprises. I'm also surprised how fast they are moving on managing this problem. I think, well, everyone is talking about the phone call that has not happened, which is between Xi and Trump, right? I think few people are talking about the even more astonishing phone call that did happen on Tuesday between Ursula von der Leyen and Chinese Prime Minister Li Qiang, where they very clearly talked about kind of managing this new situation, and even going into the direction that kind of was not on the table, anywhere near the table only a couple of weeks ago, talking about a compromise on EV tariffs and kind of replacing it, like replacing the European tariffs with a minimal price, for example. That's astonishing and fast, and not open-ended, and not sure where it goes, but the dynamic is really fast.
Ashley, again, based in Washington, as you're looking at India's evolving strategies, many have said that how India is looking at its trade agreements today is very, very different from what it has done in the past. So how are you assessing that?
So there are several strands that I want to tie together and respond in part to Evan's argument. The Indian problem is a unique problem, but it is embedded in a larger complaint. And that unique problem is, how does one create specific openings for the United States, given the decisions India made from 2017 onwards with respect to managing China? The Indian government reached the conclusion in 2017 or thereabouts that India was subjected to significant Chinese dumping. And the way to deal with that challenge of Chinese dumping was to essentially raise tariffs. Now, unfortunately, India could not find a legal solution that allowed it to target its solution to China alone. And so what they ended up doing was creating a broad brush solution that affected everyone, including the United States. Now, the Chinese learned to live with the Indian constraints because it was soonly followed up by geopolitical crises and so on and so forth that made the Indian actions essentially accounting errors in the broader scheme of things. But the United States did not look so nonchalantly at the collateral impact of Indian actions. And so since the first Trump term, the grievance has been, we need to get India to give us this differential treatment because we don't care about what your rationale for the imposition of tariffs was. We only care about the impact on our interests. And therefore, in the first Trump term, they came up with a list of items, some of which were actually legacy items that go back to Bob Zelik's conversations with India in the early 2000s, especially things relating to some agricultural items, right? So now what India is doing, given that it is at the receiving end of some very punitive measures, is looking at a targeted response. And the targeted response is essentially, we will bring down merchandise tariffs. Now, there is a bigger problem. And the bigger problem is, what are the general equilibrium effects of the second order consequences? Because it's not just a bilateral game between the United States and will there be actually opportunities for India if there is a differential tariff rate that is maintained on India's competitors? I mean, this is the point that Piyush has been making in the last few days to the consternation of people in Beijing. We don't know the answer to that. As Shruti pointed out, we are not in a world where we are simply trading finished goods from destination A to destination B. So even if there is a solution that involves India, but there are continuing tariffs on inputs and intermediate goods coming from countries outside of China, what is going to be the impact on Indian competitiveness and India's ability to play a useful role in the global trading system, right? These are all big questions for which we don't have answers.
Okay.
And until this thing shakes out, we will not be able to say anything with confidence.
Absolutely. So Shruti, given the current situation, do you think India can derive some competitive advantage from the fact that many of its potential trading rivals may have higher tariffs against their product?
Yes and no. We have to dramatically reduce our tariffs. So I agree with Ashley that we need to send a targeted signal to the United States, but there's a serious problem of tariff inversion based on all our inputs, right? So the US is our largest trading partner on the export side, but China and Asian countries are our largest trading partners on the import side. So all our export competitiveness, as Ashley mentioned, is completely short if we don't dramatically reduce tariffs or, as Evan said, join the RCEP or find some other systematic solution such that we can become the trusted place for assembly or shipping or something like that. So I think irrespective of what the rest of the world does, India must reduce its tariffs. And I think what will happen globally is, I mean, your top line tariff is 125 or 145 or whatever the posturing is tomorrow. But it'll be like license permit, Raj, right? So you'll have an extra 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then you'll start working in all the exceptions. You already have stuff for semiconductors and pharma. So we'll go back to a very cronyist way of doing things, and you'll have to strike deals one by one. But still, the signal you got to send to the world when it comes to inputs and the signal to your own manufacturers so that they have export competitiveness is to have low certain tariffs. So my advice to policymakers in India is pick a number. It should ideally be a single digit, preferably low, but maybe a high single digit number across the board for most things.
All right. So we'll now do, given the time constraint, a rapid fire round, half a minute each. So the question now is, what is the pain threshold that each society has to deal with the consequences of what's playing out? So Evans, what is going to be the pain threshold for US and for the Trump administration?
It's not knowable because it's really a political question, not an economic question. And, most people thought the president reversed course because of the bond market. So you could say that's the pain point. But of course, then the president came out the next day and said, oh, the bond market had nothing to do with it. So if the bond market had nothing to do with it, then number one, why do you do it? But number two, it means he's oblivious to what's happening when bond yields explode. That's a problem in and of itself. So I think the answer to the question is going to be political. And it's going to be at what point does the administration generally and the president personally think they're paying a price with the electorate? And the administration doesn't really care about most of the electorate. It's the part of the electorate that is most supportive of them. And that's not farmers and ranchers, because we discovered what happened last time was farmers and ranchers paid a big price, and I went out and voted for him again anyway, twice more. So it's other parts of the electorate that are not the MAGA base, but that made the difference for him. So I would watch kind of reactions to inflation, consumer behavior, and the bond market, because the advisors care about it. But I really think it's a political question, not an economic one, and it's entirely domestic in the United States.
No, sure. So Rosa, given the political churning in Europe, what will be the pain threshold in Europe to push back on tariffs and other trade measures from the US?
Yeah, I mean, politics in Europe are volatile, and I could spend the next hour talking about that. But that is one problem. And of course, it can happen in a major country that there is a volatile political situation, and that could upend the whole of the EU response. But the other thing really is Europe's economy is not in good shape. And in this context, Europe needs to really double down on deepening the single market to make it attractive for global markets. And that's not an easy task. It's been on the cards for a long time, and there have been a lot of political obstacles to creating a banking union, to creating a capital markets union, but that is actually what's needed to make sure that Europe's economy can compete with these challenges.
Okay. And beyond, how do you see China's capacity to bear pain and push back? As one of the Chinese statements said, fight till the end.
Exactly. No, yeah, and that points to exactly the right factor here. I mean, if you start your day like I do, kind of reading Chinese newspapers, you discover the language is enormously strong on kind of sacrifice that needs to be made, endurance, kind of to win that fight, and kind of really kind of also kind of mobilizing public opinion around that. And I think it kind of on balance with China's ability to do that and kind of creating a very high pain threshold in the population, I think China has an asset there, kind of on balance over kind of, an advantage perhaps over others, but also not unlimited, because COVID crisis has shown there is also limits to pain thresholds also in the Chinese population.
Ashley, so do you see India needing to bear pain or use this moment to carry out some needed changes and, in a way, charm President Trump into accommodating India's needs?
Well, I hope that India follows Shruti's advice, because I think for its own sake, a lower tariff rate is in India's own interest. But I think in the bilateral space, we are going to have a test very, very quickly, because India is essentially putting on the table large concessions on merchandise. The US, if it provides a reciprocal concessions, so suppose we have reciprocal negotiation, if it provides reciprocal concessions, it'll probably be at the tail end of the process. So in a sense, we're asking India to bear costs upfront while we provide benefits downstream. Now, will the politics in this country permit that? Will Indian exporters and Indian business tolerate that kind of a solution? Is the Prime Minister willing to take the political costs of selling that? These are going to be very big questions and not easy questions.
So you're saying be patient and come out a winner at the end.
Well, you have to come out a winner soon if this deal is to stick to begin with. But even apart from the deal, as Shruti said, you make these decisions for your own sake and not simply because we are turning the heat on you.
All right. And Shruti, final word to you. Half a minute. What's your advice to everyone? How to bring the world to sanity?
I think of pain threshold in terms of GDP per capita. We should not be delusional. We're at about 2,200. China is 6 times richer than us. South Korea is about 15 times richer than us. EU is about 30 times richer than us. And the United States is about 33 times richer than us. So that's the pain threshold. We have 1 billion people living at sub-Saharan levels on food rations. I don't think there is much room in India to play around and deal with this, few months at a time. India just needs to do broad-based reforms for its export competitiveness. And I doubt there's any way out of it at this point.
Thank you. So I think the takeaway from this is we are all in for a wild ride. We don't know what's going to happen. Hang in there. It'll eventually work out. So thank you very much. So thank you very much. And I request all of you to give the panel a big hand because they stepped up at the last minute.
A warm welcome also from my side, Mr. Goyal. It's a fantastic opportunity to have you on stage here. Having the opportunity in times like this to talk to the Indian minister responsible for all of these questions is probably a fantastic opportunity that shouldn't be missed. But I know